Laughing, my son has that very same lamp behind you in his house.
It's definitely made the rounds through life. Excellent. All right, so for anyone who is popping on right at the beginning here, my name is Serena. I work at DevPost. We are the platform that is running the Bluemixathon on behalf of IBM. And I am joined by Kyle Brown, who is a distinguished engineer and CTO cloud architect at IBM. He's going to be telling us lots of great things about disaster apps and how to work with both the IBM tools and the Bluemix tools to create some wonderful applications for this great problem. Please note that there's a couple things to keep aware of as you are viewing this webinar. Number one is that there is a little cursor on the bottom of your screen, and that's telling you where you are in representation to where we are. So if you see that there are you can pull ahead. That means you're not in real time and you're watching this delayed. So if you would like to watch it in real time, just go ahead and pull that cursor all the way to the right. You'll be able to see exactly where we are. We're also going to be answering questions from the crowd. So you can ask a QA question at any point throughout this broadcast. There will be a few points where Kyle may ask for questions, and then at the end we will definitely have some open QA time. So go ahead and click that QA button. Type your question in at any point, and then we will get to it throughout the presentation. So with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it to Kyle to kind of walk us through how Bluemix can really make a difference in disaster applications. And as you have questions, let us know, and we'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what I'm going to cover today, folks, is I'm just going to review a little bit about what we talked about when we were doing the original DeveloperWorks recording of how Bluemix can help build applications that can aid in natural disasters. So we're just going to review a little bit of that. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into answering some of the questions that people have asked already online and other various forums about how we can help you understand a little bit more about what Bluemix can do, and specifically some of the Bluemix services. But honestly, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. That's going to take at most 5 to 10 minutes, and then what we really want to open this up for is your questions, and give you the opportunity to ask any question you have about the hackathon or about how to use Bluemix, the Bluemix services. Anything you want to ask me is completely open ground for this. So we'll allow that at the end. But the first thing I want to do is, again, go through a few slides, just kind of covering a few things and reminding you of some things. So we'll start with that. So let me bring those up. All right. So the first thing I want to review are the basic ideas of who your customers are in a natural disaster from what I did in my overview presentation. And we'll go over that after we go over a few slides, or I mean just a few links on various different helpful things you can find other information on. I will then talk in a little bit more in depth about some of the specific Bluemix services and give you some ideas about how you can use some of those specific Bluemix services for your applications. And in particular, I wanted to cover the Watson services in a little more depth than I had the time to do in my other pre-recorded presentation. So hopefully it'll give you a little more background on that and a little better idea as to how you can use them. And then finally, we did have a question about resiliency in Bluemix applications and how do you make sure that your Bluemix application itself doesn't fail during a natural disaster. And we did cover that during the original presentation, but I wanted to just revisit that and make sure that everyone had a chance to understand that one. So the first thing I wanted to do is just give you guys some helpful links, and these links, in fact this entire presentation is available on SlideShare. We'll make sure that that gets posted onto the Google Hangouts replay page later, or you can go to my Twitter feed and you can look for it there, either one. A few things just to point you to that can be very helpful. As we talk about the Watson services, There's some other suggestions specific to this Bluemix hackathon that was on the DevPost site. So I wanted to point you at those and let you take a look through those. Again, if you're looking for my slides on the overview of the different ways in which Bluemix can help you in a natural disaster, we've got that link here too, along with the Bluemixathon rules and resources. And then finally, if you're just looking for the recording of my slides, where I actually went into a little more depth than what was in the slides, you can find that at DeveloperWorks at the link that we have down at the bottom. So the first thing I wanted to look at after those helpful links is, again, just going over who our customers are in a natural disaster, because that's the first question that a lot of the teams who have been looking at this Bluemixathon have been wondering is, exactly who are we writing these applications for? And I want to give you an idea of all the different customers that are potential people that can benefit from the applications that you would be creating as part of the Bluemixathon. So the first thing you need to understand is that to understand the different types of users that could be using this application, we want to think about the types of natural disasters that could be happening. Now, this could be almost anything. It could be an earthquake, it could be a fire, it could be a flood, it could be anything that is, what's called in the insurance industry an act of God, something that's unpredictable and simply is the result of the weather or, like I said, an earthquake or a fire or something like that. So the first set of customers that many of the teams have thought about that are kind of the immediate set of customers that's kind of obvious are the victims of this natural disaster. And a lot of the ideas that I went over in my initial presentation were about how do you help victims of natural disasters. But that's not the only potential customer set that you could meet the needs of in this Bluemixathon. Another one that I want to remind you of are first responders. Think about firefighters, police, different people who are there to help in the event of a natural disaster of some sort. Anything that you can do to help their job become easier or to give them more information that they need to be able to be more effective at their job is also fertile ground for any ideas that you might have. Another one that's not quite as obvious is the family, friends, and loved ones of those who are affected. People who may be geographically very distant from the disaster itself but are still affected. So if you're thinking about all the problems that we had during, let's say, Hurricane Katrina in the United States of simply locating family members after such a enormous storm like that, that can be something that you can think about. How do you help people perhaps get to find, locate, or help their own friends and family members? And then finally, there's the kind of second tier of customers that you can also think about. These would be things like the utility companies, insurance companies, transport companies that are going to be providing services to the victims. And again, anything you can think of to help those particular second tier customers help the victims themselves or be more effective at what they're doing or more quick at what they're doing would be a perfect set of things to think about. All right. Now, the next set of questions that I'll want you to think about, though, however, after you identify your initial customer set, is you need to first of all think about how does this concept that you're thinking about help them. The second thing is, will they be able to use it effectively? So many times when I look at applications like this, the question that you have to address is, it's a great, good-looking, slick application, but when a disaster strikes, will they be able to use it effectively? You need to be able to think through those kinds of questions. And then finally, the last thing you need to address is it better than what's out there? The very first thing you need to do after you do your initial concept thinking and sort of working with your team to come up with your idea is do a Google search or a Baidu search or something like that to see if there's anyone else there that has come up with the same or a similar idea. And if they have, you need to figure out exactly what it is that makes your idea better. Now, the next thing I wanted to look at was in the talk that we did that the previous slide was an excerpt from, we talked about some very specific ideas for application types that you can use in a natural disaster. And the way that I did that is I went through Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of 7 different needs that we all have psychologically and physically, and use that as a guidance to allow us to be able to think of different types of applications at each of the different levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I, again, encourage you to go back and look at those. But as we did that, all we were able to do is talk about some very specific services in Bluemix that were particular to those particular ideas. Now, at the end, we also talked a little bit about the IBM DevOps services, which are also helpful when you're building your Bluemix applications and deploying your Bluemix applications. But we really didn't do a quick survey of all the different possibilities of the different services that are available inside the Bluemix catalog. So this is something that I want to just spend a few minutes looking over and giving you some ideas on that. Now, the first category of services that many of us think about when we're building applications are, of course, databases. And Bluemix has a number of different options for data storage. We have a number of different SQL databases, including ones that are based on DB2, Postgres, MySQL, a number of others. But also you want to think about the NoSQL databases. And by this I mean things like Mongo, Redis, a lot of the other competitors to those that we also support in Bluemix. And you want to think about what's the appropriate type of database for the particular type of data that you're storing. So for instance, if you are doing a data analysis application to where people are going to be doing unknown queries ahead of time, and you simply want to be able to, for instance, ask detailed questions about let's say the ages and the addresses and the marital status and all sorts of other things about particular people that may be in a disaster area, that would be the perfect solution for a SQL database, like, again, Postgres or MySQL or one of the DB2 options. But on the other hand, if all you're doing is trying to do something like, let's say, storing tweets for later analysis, or just storing very quick information in JSON that you're going to be using as part of your application, that's probably going to be much better done in one of the NoSQL options like IBM's Cloudant or like Mongo or Redis or something like that. All right, so those are our database options. Another one that you'll want to think about are what I'm calling the gateway options. The gateway options are different services that help you get data into and out of Bluemix. One of the ones that we did talk about during the previous presentation is the Internet of Things Gateway, which we gave a couple of cool examples of different drone or robot ideas that you can use and control through the Internet of Things Gateway. But that's not the only one. We also talked about Twilio as being another example of ways that you can bridge from your application that's running in Bluemix into, let's say, SMS messaging. A couple of other ones that are worth talking about are SendGrid, which is specific to being able to send and receive email from a Bluemix application. And then there's API management. API management is if you want to expose some parts of your application as an API for others to build other applications on. That's a great possibility, and if your application is very successful, that may be something that you want to look into then. The secure gateway is about getting to things that are behind a corporate firewall somewhere. That may or may not be as applicable to this hackathon, but it's still something to think about in case you need to be able to, let's say, get to a specific store of data that you have available that someone may be offering up for use during a natural disaster like that. Now, then finally, the other thing you want to think about is how you're going to present your data and how you're going to analyze your data. Again, the visualization and analysis tools are going to be probably much more applicable for the types of applications that are data processing applications. So if you think about something that is, again, about helping locate specific types of people that may have specific skills that could be helpful during a natural disaster. Let's say that what you're doing is you're trying to help form teams that can aid victims in a natural disaster. And so what you want to do is you want to see who out of your list of volunteers may have, let's say, a nursing degree or maybe a medical doctor. That's the kind of thing that you would do, again, with a SQL database, but you may want to do some analytics using one of our different analytics options that you see in the analysis column. Well, once you've done that, then you have to think about how you present that data. Well, that's what the visualization column gives you, lots of different options for doing that. Probably the simplest to understand is embeddable reporting. If you just want to be able to pop up a report and allow the user of your system to be able to view that text-based report, that's what embeddable reporting does. But on the other hand, if you wanted to do something a little more sophisticated, like, oh, let's say generate a PDF document that you then later send out using SendGrid over email, that's where you could use one of the other visualization options. And then finally, there's a couple of other ones that, again, we did briefly mention some of these during the other presentation. And that's the geocoding ones that are offered by Pitney Bowes for translating between latitude and longitude, or GPS coordinates and addresses. And we also talked about Watson Natural Language Translation and its ability to move back and forth between languages like Spanish and English and a number of other languages. And then finally, there's DataWorks, which is about simply moving data in between different databases and doing different transformations of that data as it moves back and forth. Okay? Now, the final thing I want to talk about on this is if you are thinking about an application that is going to get very sophisticated in some of the data manipulation and data analysis that it wants to do. Again, one of the ideas that we talked about during that other presentation was the idea of perhaps having drones that did mapping of various sites in a natural disaster, you know, kind of being able to help first responders out that way. If you had that kind of a data set, you would need to do some pretty sophisticated analytics on it. And that's where one of the more specialized analysis options that we have in Bluemix, like geospatial analytics, would come into play. Likewise, if you were trying to do real-time data analysis of things that are coming in, let's say over the IoT gateway, that's where something like streaming analytics would come in. Or if you're helping people to prepare for a natural disaster ahead of time based on the responses to things that have happened in the past, that's where you would use something like predictive modeling. Okay? All right. So if those are the basic ones, the other ones that I wanted to focus in a little bit more, because we simply didn't have time to do this earlier, are some of the Watson APIs. And we'll talk a little bit about how some of these Watson APIs may be helpful in the kinds of applications that you're building. Now, in particular, what I wanted to zoom into is a subset of the total set of Watson APIs that we didn't get a chance to talk to and give any ideas from, which are the Alchemy APIs. Now, the Alchemy APIs are basically divided up into two different categories, natural languages and images APIs. And each of them could be helpful in different situations. I'm really going to focus more on the natural language ones for a couple of ideas that I wanted to explore and just give you some ideas to look at. But the natural language ones include things like sentiment analysis and language detection, and then something called microformat parsing. I'll kind of give you some ideas as to a couple of these in the next couple of pages. So let's start with the one called sentiment analysis. So let's say that what you're doing is that you're one of these second-tier responders, meaning that you're an insurance company or a power company, and what you want to know is you want to know how well you're serving the victims in this natural disaster. So let's say, again, let's take the example of you may be a utility company, and you want to know how people's tweets are trending with regard to your restoration of service in their area. Well, that's what sentiment analysis can help you do. What you can do with sentiment analysis is you can analyze a large set of text, perhaps that you would capture from Twitter, and then you can look at it for positive or negative feelings that are expressed in that text. And then once you've categorized it this way, you could then map that to, for instance, geospatial information about where the person was tweeting from and try to help understand how well you're meeting the needs of the particular victims in that particular geographical area. And so that's one example of how you could use the sentiment analysis service from Watson and Bluemix to be able to write an application. Now, another one that is also really cool that might give you some ideas, and you might be able to think about some things here, is a Watson service called Tradeoff Analytics. What Tradeoff Analytics helps you do is it helps you choose options between different possible decisions based upon the different criteria and the different strengths and weaknesses of each of the different options. So again, let's take one that's very stark here. Let's say that you are a victim in a natural disaster, and it's just you and your phone, and you are trying to figure out what your best housing option is. And there may be different possibilities you have. You may, be able to drive and go to a hotel and pay for that, or you may be directed to a Red Cross shelter, or maybe even there's other options that we haven't thought about. Perhaps people on Airbnb that are opening up their houses. How do you weigh these different things and maybe compare not only the costs but relative distance to your work, ability to get in and out of these things, maybe even intangibles like safety? How would you do that? Well, that's exactly what Tradeoff Analytics can help you do. We help you to be able to rank and rate these different options and then be able to present this to the user in a way that you can help them make the right decision. Okay? Now, the last thing that I wanted to review from that last presentation is, again, the basic question of, well, what about my application, how would I use, or how would I make it work in a situation where the natural disaster actually affected the place where the application is running? Well, in fact, that's one of the advantages that Bluemix has, is that Bluemix, being a cloud provider, has data centers in multiple different locations that you can run your application in. And in fact, if you are trying to provide an application that would have continuous availability, which would be necessary in a natural disaster like this, because natural disasters can strike Dallas or London the same way they can Tokyo or Paris. What I would recommend is that you deploy your application into as many of the available Bluemix data centers as you have. Now today, that means you would deploy it into both Dallas and London. We've announced that very soon we'll be expanding to other data centers around the globe. For instance, there's Sydney. But the idea is very simple in that you want to make sure there's more than one copy of your application running. And the way you do that is you use IBM DevOps services, and you make sure that you deploy your application to more than one place, so that in a disaster you would then just be able to flip over your external DNS server and change the address of where your application is available to point to one of these different data centers if one of them becomes unavailable. Okay, and with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and we can go back to our Q&A. Okay? All right. Serena, all yours.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kyle. That was a really lovely synopsis, and I think gave people a lot of things to think about. So just an all call to everybody at this point who's watching. If you have questions, that now is the time to post them. Like I said before, you can post them using the QA feature in Google Hangouts, which should be over on the left-hand portion of your screen. And if you have difficulty doing that for whatever reason, you can feel free to post your questions onto the actual event page, and we'll go ahead and answer those. There are a couple of questions that have come in so far, and I'm just taking a quick look here to make it through. Okay. So one question that we have is actually a repeat from one that came in last time, which is, what type of database is best to use to store simple data objects like a person's name or address? What's the best database for folks to look at within Bluemix for that?
It really depends on what you want to do with it. It's not so much the data itself as it is what you're going to be doing with the data. Let's say if all you're wanting to do is just store an address and you're always going to be just getting those addresses back by the person's name or some unique ID like an ID number or something like that, it's probably simplest to store that in one of the NoSQL database options, and I would suggest IBM Cloud. That makes a lot of sense for simple, very responsive databases, especially if what you're going to be storing the data in and using the data in is in a JSON format. Okay, and that's common if you're building Node.js and JavaScript applications. But on the other hand, again, if you wanted to not only be able to store names and addresses, but like I was talking earlier, we were saying, oh, you also want to store their occupation and you want to store, let's say, any certifications they have. Or are they a certified lifeguard or certified in CPR or something like that? When you start adding that kind of data and then you start wanting to do arbitrary queries or questions about that kind of data, that's where a SQL database, let's say like the Postgres option we have on Compose.io, would be probably a better solution. Okay.
Got it. Great answer. The next question that has come in is kind of more of a generic one. It's asking, what are the most common pitfalls that people have when they're building for disasters? Are there any pro tips on just kind of what to avoid as you're thinking about how to even approach that problem?
Sure. I will tell you that the worst problem that we see in people doing these kinds of hackathons like this and building applications like this are trying to do too much too fast. So the best advice I can give in that situation is try to figure out what the central core of your idea is. In the Bluemix Garage method, we call that your minimal viable product. What's the absolute smallest thing that you can possibly get away with and still have people consider it to be useful? And just focus on building that. Don't worry about fancy bells and whistles. Don't worry about it being natively available on iOS and Android. Don't worry about using all of the coolest new technologies. Just build something simple that does only what you need, and then build from there and expand that as time goes on. But that's the best advice I can give you, to start small, start simple.
That's a really, really good piece of advice, Kyle. Just a quick follow-up on my own curiosity. Any specific Bluemix services that you can think of that make the most sense in that type of a start small type of range? Obviously, there are tons of Bluemix services available that do many, many different things. But any ones that come to mind for you as good places to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you there's a couple of combinations that a lot of times we'll start with that just give you somewhere to start when you're trying to work on those first 1 or 2 user stories. It may not be where you end up, but at least it's a good environment to start from. The first is the boilerplates that we have in Bluemix for Node.js and Cloud. Because again, if all you're wanting to do is, let's say, have a very simple database and a very simple application that's going to return a REST service to give you back some information from that, the Node and Cloud and boilerplate is a great place to start because it'll get you up and running on that very, very quickly. If you're not familiar with Node.js and you would prefer to do that in Java, we have a Java and Cloud and boilerplate that's also just as effective. Or likewise, if you're one of these people that prefers Ruby and Ruby on Rails, we've got Ruby on Rails and we've got Sinatra too, that also are boilerplates with very simple databases. And that's where I'd start, is just with one of those, because they have already running sample code, and you can modify that to get your first service up and actually have something that you can then write a test to and demonstrate that it's going to pass that first test. Okay?
Awesome. That was a great answer. Next question that's come in, we have a question that says, are there any unique considerations when using a third-party API with a Bluemix service?
Ooh, this is interesting. Okay, let me carefully answer this one. There's 2 types of third-party APIs that we can consider. The first is one that is entirely outside of Bluemix and isn't even part of the Bluemix catalog. Okay, so an example like this would be using Google Maps. Lots of different applications just use Google Maps to display their geographical data. And the data itself may be coming, as I said, from one of the geospatial analytics or, geospatial database options that we have in Bluemix, but simply to display it on a map, you'll use Google Maps for that. The consideration you have to think about when you're doing that is, number one, you've just introduced another dependency into your application as a whole. So now it's not only the possibility that if Bluemix goes down in that particular data center, you would have to fail over. Now you've also brought in Google. So, there's a possibility that the Google Maps API may go offline for a short period of time, and you have to think about what you're going to do as an option then. You may just want to give them a simple text and HTML option instead of a fancy map, perhaps. Give them something like that. There's a couple of patterns that people have commonly used for things like that. One of them is called the circuit breaker pattern, which was described in the book Release It. It, again, is also described on our IBM Garage Method website, that you can use for dealing with possibilities of when things can fail like that. Another thing you want to think about is, even if you are using a third-party API that is part of the Bluemix catalog. Again, let me use one from our friends at Pitney Bowes, okay? The thing is that's hosted by a third party. Pitney Bowes is the one that hosts that, and they are the ones who are responsible for keeping it up. So it's not something that IBM can guarantee. It's basically, we are, doing a pass-through of the services and helping you connect directly to them. So that's another consideration you also have to think about, and that's where you would use the same approach, something like a circuit breaker pattern or some other similar way of being able to simply say that if it becomes unavailable, you want to have a reasonable backup or a reasonable alternative to be able to use it instead. Okay?
Great. Kyle, you've mentioned the garage method a couple of times. Could you say a little bit more about what that is?
Absolutely. This is something that we announced at IBM last week at the DevOps Enterprise Summit. And it is the method, as in the development methodology that we use in my organization, the IBM Bluemix Garage. And you can find out more about that by visiting the website, which is at ibm.com/devops/method. And it will just walk you straight through all the different considerations of, the things you need to think about when you're trying to structure a team that's going to be building things on Bluemix. And
Wow.
it has links to tools and lots of videos and write-ups of people of their experiences on doing DevOps with Bluemix and our other cloud options, and it gives you lots of ideas of how to structure your team. Not necessarily how you're going to build your application, but at least it tells you all the things you need to do once you've decided what application you're going to build.
Nice, nice. So is it fair to say that if you want to learn how Kyle thinks about building an application and what processes he goes through, that's where you should go check that out?
Absolutely. Me and my co-conspirator, Rachel Reinitz, who's the CTO of the Bluemix Garage and one of my other DEs in my team, contributed a lot to many of the different articles and parts of that site to make sure that we are really taking our ideas and showing people how we solve things inside the garage.
Very cool. That's an awesome resource. Thanks for that.
Okay.
Next question. Okay, I've heard the term Bluemix Offline, especially with respect to mobile apps. I can see this possibly applying in a disaster situation, but I'm not really sure what the term means and what it's really referring to.
That's an interesting one. That's not actually an official IBM term.
Okay, good to know.
So let me think a little bit about the different possibilities you could have with that. There's two that come to mind. First is, anytime you're building a mobile application, you have to consider the possibility that the application itself may have to function when there's no internet connectivity. Okay? And when that happens, what you want to be able to do is design the front end of your application in such a way that at least it will be able to handle some sort of minimal interface and minimal functionality if it can't reach your back end. So a lot of times that's through doing things like being able to store storage so that you might be able to cache things locally. Again, let's say that what you're doing is you were displaying a map. that you were getting from Google or that you had downloaded from somewhere else, and displaying, a little moving dot on the map on your mobile app. Well, if you lose connectivity to the internet, at least you can still have that map cached in local storage on the mobile device, and you can at least, if you're using the GPS tracker in the phone, you can continue to show the dot at least until it reaches the edge of the map. You may not be able to do much more than that, but that is a design consideration that you do want to think about when you're using mobile devices. Now, I do talk about that in my book, Modern Web Development for IBM WebSphere, that we wrote a couple years ago with another one of my distinguished engineer colleagues, Roland Barcia, and I. But that's kind of a sophisticated plan to put this kind of thing in place for a mobile application. I certainly wouldn't consider that something you build in the first iteration of your application. That would one of these things that you do much, much later in the development process.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess I'm trying to think from a developer perspective, if I'm creating an application for a disaster scenario in which it's very likely that I may not have internet access, any general tips outside of, obviously creating a front end that would allow for that?
Surprisingly enough, and this is something I did talk about in the original video, even in recent natural disasters, minimal internet connectivity is actually something that you can maybe not necessarily assume 100% of the time, but you will be able to assume that you can get some of it some of the time. Now, again, if it's something that is meant to be used during a natural disaster that is giving life-saving information, that would be something you'd want to store locally in your app. Absolutely. So if it was things about, how to deal with something like snakebite or how to treat injuries or something like that, absolutely you would store that in the app directly. But on the other hand, if it's something like, how do you find someone or how do you locate something, you're really not going to be able to do much with that without internet connectivity. But what we've seen in recent natural disasters is, even though it may be at a reduced bandwidth, that especially cell phone connectivity to the internet does continue to function in most cases.
Wow.
Yeah, it's actually been interesting.
I'm kind of shocked by this.
Think about it. The original internet was designed to survive a nuclear attack.
I did not know that.
It was a DARPA-funded project, and the entire internet protocol was designed to be available and continue to function in the case of all, most of the nodes being taken out by nuclear attacks. And so that kind of redundancy and ability to work around breaks is something that the internet still retains. And what we've seen as, different people have looked at this is, even just if a few cell towers are still operating, you'll still be able to get cell service even though it may be at a much reduced data rate. It may be spotty.
Got it.
That at least allows you to do something in most cases.
Well, that's interesting. That's really interesting. I had no idea. So maybe think about ways to tier the service down where you don't need as much data interactivity, where you can maybe go towards an SMS type of thing or get stored locally as things coming through, that type of thing.
Totally, and those are some of the suggestions that I gave in the previous video of, you want to watch your bandwidth very carefully during the event. Before the event, you can be as profligate of your bandwidth as you want to. But during the event, you want to get it down to the minimum you can actually use.
Very smart. Awesome. So a lot of people have asked, what is that URL of that video that Kyle is referring to? That's a great question. So what I've done is I've posted it on the actual Google event page. We had it posted before, but we pulled it out. Kyle, anything for folks that are joining us that haven't watched that video that you think is relevant outside of what we've discussed already that is worth highlighting?
That I haven't talked about. Okay.
I know, right? Tough question.
One of the things that is worth just reminding people that's in there is we do talk about not only some ideas, which are helpful for teams that are trying to get started, but we talk about the tools for building Bluemix applications. And so that second half of the video is especially useful for being able to see that and be able to understand, perhaps if you started with the IBM Garage method we've been talking about, and understand how to organize your team, and you want to know what tools your team needs to use and how they can use them, that we covered in the second half.
Got it. Yeah, and just quick follow up on that. So let's say that that I go and watch that second half, and I have a bunch of extra questions based on that great information that you put forth. What's the best way for me to get that answered? Would that be to go to the Developer Works forum, or are there other places that are more appropriate?
Absolutely. Well, there's going to be two that I'm going to suggest. The Developer Works forum is absolutely fantastic, especially I'm going to say around questions around the IBM Bluemix DevOps services. The development team for that particular set of services hangs out in the Developer Works forum quite often, and you are going to see a lot of very quick, very good feedback there from that team. Another option that you can also think about is if you just wanted to post your questions onto some of the other internet forums. And I'm blanking on the name of the one that I use every day.
Stack Overflow, perhaps?
Overflow, thank you. And I'm going, I was going to have to go visit the site and see what, yes. Oh, it's one of these things to where I was thinking Slack, and I'm going, no, not Slack. That's how we contribute, how we talk internally.
Yeah.
The names are too close. If you go to Stack Overflow and you ask a question there, you will also get pretty good response pretty quickly from the different development teams. And I would say, in fact, if you're trying to ask us a question about a specific Bluemix service, like the MongoDB service or one of the Compose.io services, you'll probably get a really good response there. Okay.
Perfect. Sounds good. All right, next question. And I'm running low, so everybody who has questions out there, please don't be shy. Don't be shy. All right, so next question is, now that IBM has purchased the weather company, oh, that just happened, didn't it? Do you foresee a lot more meteorological API data shared through Bluemix? Any thoughts on how this merger is going to help with Bluemix and disaster reduction or, disaster recovery or risk reduction?
Again, not so much, disaster recovery for the application, making the application available in two places, but for building applications about recovering from disasters. Yes, the weather company APIs that we've now acquired as part of the new purchase are very, very helpful in trying to understand both the potential risks that can come as a result of weather, but also trying to understand trends. And you see, that's where I think the information is really going to be interesting. Because one of the cool things about these APIs is you can go back and you can look for historical data. And then you can use some of the analytics services in Bluemix to take that historical data and combine it with other historical data and really gain some interesting insight.
All of a sudden you've got predictions, right?
Absolutely. In fact, several months ago, when there was the first announcement of, at that point, it was simply a joint agreement that IBM and the weather company had come together to announce. There were some interesting insights in Fortune magazine and a few other places about what this combination can give. And the example they gave is that in different cities, when the forecast is coming for serious rain or serious snow, different things are purchased and become unavailable in the stores. And that's be almost a local or regional decision as to what people are going to go out and buy, if it's going to rain. So if you're in Cleveland, the stores may be out of skim milk, and if you're in Columbus, it may be something entirely different.
Wow.
And so that kind of thing, is the kind of insight that can help you do better planning. Because if you know that, for instance, every time they're going to forecast a tornado in the area, that the stores are going to be out of something, that may give you better options on, well, if you drove 20 minutes away, you might find those things available in the stores. And it may give you a better option on different ways to make sure that you or your family are protected, or that your business is going to be able to serve the needs of the people that you're serving. Okay?
Yeah, that's great. And it kind of brings up a whole other topic as far as what other data is important to consider when you're thinking about disaster recovery. It's not only about contacting your neighbors, it might also be about, where do I find fresh water, or where do I find a piece of bread, or what have you.
Absolutely, and one of the things we talked about in the other video were different sources of information that you can go to. And you know, obviously we now have things like the weather company data to be able to, you know, give you meteorological data. But a couple of other things you want to think about are not only data that people are entering into your applications, but data that's available in publicly available data stores, particularly governmental data stores.
Mm.
That is a great resource. I mean, if you go to places like the NGIS, the National Geological Survey, or you go to the National Weather Service, or you go to you know, lots of other publicly available data places that the federal and state governments supply like that, that gives you raw data that you can then help do analysis on and turn that into knowledge that people can use when they need it. And I actually did give one example of, you know, let's say that what you were doing was trying to find potential sites to be able to, let's say, do drone takeoffs from.
Right.
Okay? And in that drone example I was talking about,
he really likes it. It's a good one.
well, you know, one of the things that we were looking at is you could actually go out to your state and local governments and find out where all the parks are. And
yeah,
you know,
where could a drone take off?
Exactly. And you know, in a natural disaster, you're not going to be playing baseball. So go find all the baseball field, and you know that's going to be the best option for you if it's not being used for something else. So there you go. Okay.
Cool, cool. That's great. Okay, next question. Of the 4 categories we're being asked to build apps for, which group do you feel has the least amount of attention? Meaning, where is the best potential for us to build something unique and helpful?
That's an interesting question. Let me go quickly review the 4 sets again. I've got that here handy in my browser. I just need to go get that.
Yeah, no, I think probably everyone could use that little mini review.
Yeah. Okay. Just got to go back to the home of the Bluemixathon and look that up again. Okay. Yeah, it was. Oh, in fact, it's the same set that I was looking at in my first slide. Now I remember.
Looks like it.
Okay. So let me tell you the one that I think are going to be probably the most underserved. It's the bottom 2. The first 2 are the ones that it's kind of easy to think up ideas for. The bottom 2 are the ones that it gets a little bit more difficult, especially when you're talking about the groups and relief organizations doing the long-term rebuilding. Okay. That's where also you're going to get much more beyond the first layer of applications. Now, let me use a couple of examples of types of applications that you build in Bluemix. In Bluemix, most of the applications that we build are what we call systems of interaction. They're mobile applications where, you know, we've talked about all these great things you can do with maps, and, you know, you could, you know, try to find people based on different things and show you where they're located and things like that. But that's you interacting with your phone, okay? And then interacting with other people too. But there's another whole type of application that you can build in Bluemix, and that's called a system of insight. A system of insight is when you're looking at a lot of different types of data and you're trying to gain knowledge out of the correlations and the relationships between those data. Well, that's a slower thing to build because, first of all, you have to acquire the data. You then sometimes have to massage it into the right form to be able to process it in something like Big Insights for Hadoop or Apache Spark or DashDB. And then you have to actually write and run the analysis on it and present the result. It's a more involved process than simply, you know, throwing up a quick mobile application that you build, you know, just kind of off of Swift and Node.js. But those are the type of applications, especially for those later 2 categories, the relief organizations and governmental agencies and things like hospitals and healthcare networks. Those are the ones that they actually need more help with because it's that kind of long-term assistance that gets complicated. Let me give you one example, and I don't think I actually mentioned this in the previous talk, but it's probably worth talking about. One of the things that has come to light as a result of looking back over several years now at the aid that came during the Haiti earthquake is that the different relief organizations, and in particular the American Red Cross, were absolutely fantastic at immediate aid to the victims of the earthquake. You know, if it comes down to just helping their immediate food shelter needs, the bottom layer of Maslow's hierarchy, that was fantastic. And they were able to provide tents and food and clean water and, you know, do that kind of thing very quickly. Where the aid organizations began to fall down is in the rebuilding effort. And a lot of that was an informational problem. Because if you're talking about rebuilding an entire neighborhood, there's a lot of coordination that has to happen and a lot of data that has to come together. You have to understand difficulties like who has legal title to this land, what are building codes, where are existing pipes and other utilities located. And if you're trying to do this on a large scale, much more so than a single contractor building a single house or rebuilding a single house, it gets very difficult. And that is where many of these aid organizations didn't have that kind of background and they didn't have that kind of information. And as a result, they were not successful in helping these organizations to do that until they finally realized that the only way they could do it was simply to enlist local agencies and local companies that were more aware of what those particular local conditions were and how to do that. So if you focused on that and you looked at, you know, how do you kind of bring these two sets of information together, especially in areas and locales where perhaps this isn't published as well as it is in the US and Canada, you know, to where it's all available online, and you looked at something like how do I take a country like Nepal and kind of make land use and land ownership records available online, that's a much longer term issue, but in the end it may have a much bigger payoff. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Awesome. Okay, well, at this point, I am out of questions. So we're going to hang out for a couple more minutes just in case somebody gets brave and post another one up there. Kyle, just to give you a kind of synopsis of where we are at this point, we have 2 weeks left in the submission period. So if folks are thinking about, you know, how do I get started? You know, how do I even tackle this problem? It seems like the easiest way would be kind of those first couple of categories where there is a lot of competition in the sphere for probably that same reason. But that if you were to get a start on one of those latter categories, that they potentially could have the most long-term benefit if you kept going. Is that right?
And again, focus on this idea of what's the smallest thing that you can demonstrate. Because, you know, if you look at the different things that the applications are being judged on, you know, there's lots of different areas in which they will be viewed on, you know, and one of them is kind of, oh, let's call it the cool factor. But, you know, there are also questions of impact on that, that the judges will be taking a look at as well. And so if you can think of something that, you know, does have a huge impact, but perhaps you can't necessarily show the entire end-to-end system working, but you can show enough of it to convince the judges that, you know, your idea has merit, then that is something that is still worth looking at, even if you can't show the entire thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, final question that just popped in here. This is current events question. So what would you like to see made to help the India earthquake victims?
That's an interesting question. So again, I've been to India many, many times. And one of the cool things about India is everyone has phones. They're generally not smartphones, they're feature phones. But that means they have SMS. And in fact, all my Indian friends are constantly texting back and forth. So the first thing that I'd want to say is it would have to be an application that would be able to work, you know, either with a smartphone or just a feature phone to be able to do SMS. One of the things that would perhaps be really cool here, and this is something that honestly I've personally run into, is coordination of different aid groups. And just making sure that, you know, in a particular area, that if you want to make sure that people in that particular area are being assisted, what are the aid groups that are actually working with that area? And, you know, geographically, can I just narrow it down and say that, you know, look, I have a particular group of people that I know that are in the state of Uttar Pradesh. I don't know. I haven't even, sorry, I don't even know which area in India the earthquake hit. I'm sorry, my mistake. But let's say there's a particular city or a particular state or region that you want to make sure is getting aid, and you can kind of narrow it down by that. Just even a simple application to be able to type that in and see who's actually working there would be great. And if you could then be able to link that to their websites and be able to donate to those particular sites, that would be great. Because in fact, for an emergency like this, it's making sure that the aid agencies that are on the ground have the resources they need. And so for what we could do immediately is just making sure that the ones in the right areas have all the resources they need. So there you go. There's one quick answer that you can start to look at and see what you can do now. Okay?
Yeah, that's a really good one. And actually doesn't sound like it would be that tremendously involved. It's pretty straightforward, but necessary. So words of wisdom from Kyle Brown. Thank you so very much for chatting with us today and giving us all of these great tips. Everyone, if you have any additional questions for Kyle after the fact, we're about to log off here, but if something strikes you in the middle of the night and you have to know, please feel free to post them to the competition discussion board, which is bluemix.devpost.com. There's a link to the forum right in there. You can post questions on the DW Answers forum, or you could just email me, serena@devpost.com, and we will get those questions answered for you. Can't wait to see what you build. And thanks again, Kyle. We'll talk to you soon.